Good afternoon, Commissioner. Philip Eidsvik, still on for the area gilletters in the BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. Before the break, Mr. Woody, we were talking about the early entry problem, what you call the elephant in the room, and we got to the point where we were discussing the events in 2001 where there was awareness of a problem and you have proposed a solution, and we were talking about the results. And if I understand correctly, we put a lot of fish up the river in 2001 from the summer run and from the late run, in excess on summer, and 90 or 95 or even higher % of fish that died from the early entry late run, which we could have harvested, and this had deleterious impacts on the following cycles. I'm a little bit interested now in just how the advice on that worked, because there must have been a debate inside the Commission on what to do, and you said your solution, and you said you advised the Fraser panel. What was the Fraser panel's reaction to your advice? Do you remember?
Mr. Commissioner, the details are in the Fraser River Panel annual report to the PSC, Pacific Commission, for 1991, or 2001, excuse me. And the issue was not resolved on the Fraser River Panel level because the U.S. side and the Canadian side could not agree upon the strategy that Canada was proposing. And they bumped it up to the commissioners, to the Salmon Commission members themselves, and there was negotiation there, and the Canadian side made an adjustment on the proportion or percentage of harvest permitted on late run stocks. And then, but that was some adjustments. I can't remember the numbers, from 15% harvest to 19% harvest. And that was accepted by the Pacific Salmon Commission and implemented then by the Fraser River Panel.
That's helpful. On the Fraser River Panel, of course, the chair of the panel is a DFO staff person in recent years. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't...
I'm sorry, the chair of the Fraser River Panel, is that usually a DFO official?
The chair of the panel rotates between the Canadian side and the U.S. side. And traditionally, when the chair is on the Canadian side, it would be a DFO member, a DFO staff member. And the person that was the chair of the panel at that point, I have the report I could check, but it wasn't, it's not in my memory.
That's fine. The position that industry took in 2001, do you remember that? When I say the industry, I refer to the public commercial fishery representatives on the panel. Do you remember their position?
No, I was never given anything but a basic rejection of my proposal.
Okay.
And at that time, the caucus, the Canadian caucus, had developed their policy and presented it to the U.S. side.
An earlier witness before the commission said that two sockeye stocks had gone extinct. I think Terry Glavin was a witness, and he referred to the Alouette and Coquitlam rivers, but we never did get an explanation of why those runs went extinct. The Alouette and Coquitlam, do you know why they went extinct?
The Alouette and I believe the Coquitlam both went extinct because dams were built in the, well, certainly the Alouette, I believe, was the mid-20s, 1920s, and that dam was high enough that it was not fitted with a fish ladder, and at that time the powers that be, the provincial fisheries manager at that time, or responsible person, agreed that due to the power production demands that the sockeye run would not be protected. That and the Coquitlam, I think, was primarily a water source dam, reservoir for water source. But the details are not.
Thank you. I had one more question on escapement. Now, in the mid-'60s, Fraser River sockeye were at very low levels, and obviously there was a fishing industry that was quite active with lots of vessels. And probably on the commission, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you always had, okay, how do we balance our desire to increase the run with our desire to maintain fisheries? Did you have an escapement policy that accomplished those goals? I mean, obviously the runs were rebuilt from the 60s, 70s, 80s. There was a viable fishing industry. Did you have an escapement policy during that period? I don't really understand what happened then.
I was not aboard the commission staff until '71, and therefore I can't necessarily answer the question relative to the '60s. But in the '70s, the Pacific Salmon, the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission, definitely had a policy of ensuring that the conservation of the stocks was foremost. But at the same time, they recognized the economic and social values that were posed through the commercial fishery. And I say commercial fishery because their responsibility was strictly with the commercial fishery. And Canada's responsibility was for the First Nations Aboriginal fisheries.
Thank you. I have one more question. If we could turn to exhibit, I think 75. And it's the book by John Roos called Restoring Fraser River Sockeye. And we're at page 303. And if we go to the page 303, the very last sentence in that paragraph, and I'll read it. The Commission's ability to get the job done was primarily related to the simplicity of its mandate and the efficient manner in which it was permitted to implement the decision-making process. Do you agree with that statement, Mr. Woody or Dr. Woody?
Yes. The powers delegated by the countries to the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission were, if you will, nearly absolute. In other words, both countries delegated all responsibility to the commissioners, 3 from each country. And therefore, when the commission made a decision about an issue, it became implemented on both sides as part of the responsibility of the countries to undertake for the implementation of regulations. But the fact that it was a very short line of command then led to, let's say, more efficient operation. Some of those people that were instrumental were Senator Bill Reid, Senator from New Westminster. He was Senator of the Canadians, Federal Senate. And on the U.S. side, people that were either from Washington, D.C. or had direct contact with people in Washington, D.C. that then made the lines of decision-making very quick, very short. So, say when money was needed to build the Hell's Gate fishways in the early 40s, even during the war period, it was deemed sufficiently important that both countries funded that request of the commissioners in 1942-43. and that was the you would expect that would have been very difficult, but it was done because it was deemed to be a very high priority issue to rebuild the Fraser River stocks.
Now, so in those days, if you were faced with a decision like you were faced with in 2001, it would have been easier to make a decision because there wasn't so many people involved in the room, I guess is what you're saying in essence. It's easier when there's a direct line of communication.
It was a different world back then, but I can't honestly relate because I wasn't there in the 40s, and I would say certainly there were, from the IPSSC perspective, only two clients, the fish and the fishermen, the commercial fishermen. And they had an advisory committee, members from the fishing, commercial fishery, sport fishery advisory group at that time.
Now, at page 33 of this book, there's a quotation and a discussion by a Dr. Whit Gilbert, and it's about, there was a strong debate in those days whether the Hell's Gate ladders needed to be built. And in his book, he says, and here was the great fallacy in which the men fell so readily, that the block at Hell's Gate had been removed by the subsequent excavation, that pre-1913 conditions had been restored, that such conditions wholly satisfied for the satisfactory migration of sockeye, that all salmon which escaped the commercial fishery spawned effectively, and number 5, that overfishing was the sole cause of the continued low level of sockeye abundance, and 6, that the situation could be corrected by controlling men and their fishing. So even back in I guess this is from the pre-1940s, there's the debate about whether overfishing is solely responsible. But I think, is it fair to say that the success of the Hell's Gate ladders proved that Mr. Dr. Gilbert is right when he was saying we needed to solve the Hell's Gate ladder issue? Maybe can I rephrase that, Mr. Dr. Woody, if that's a problem? That was a bit of a ramble question. Or do you have an answer you want to give?
Mr. Commissioner, the people in after 1913 did an extraordinary amount of work, engineering work, to try to restore Hell's Gate to a pre-slide condition. When I say pre-slide, that means that there was a great amount of rock that came into the river that then constricted the flow of the river, made it difficult for fish to get through. And they removed a lot of that loose rock, which was dumped into the river by the construction of the CN track line through the canyon. And it remained, after it had been so-called cleaned up, the people locally said, well, we've done our job and therefore it didn't need to be done. And so as part of the controversy, when the engineering people went from the IPSFC, went in and looked at the velocities that were at the Hell's Gate at various water levels, determined they actually built a whole model of Hell's Gate at the University of Washington Engineering hydrology department in the engineering department, and looked at the velocities at different water levels and so on. And the result of that was a determination that there were, in fact, blockage conditions at certain water levels at certain locations, and where rock was protruding into the river and causing difficulty with fish passage. that convinced the engineers that needed the fishways. The fishways were built, beginning in the first one being completed in 1945, and other fishways that were what we call higher level fishways, operational at higher water levels into the early 60s. They proved very successful in passing fish with little delay, and in fact, when after the extinction of the IPSFC at the end of 1985, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans did construct additional facilities. So there was recognition, certainly, that those fishways were required and were certainly justified.
So if there was two debates at that point, if we had to focus simply on controlling the alleged overfishing by the marine fishing fleet and not built the Hell's Gate ladders, would we have had the success in rebuilding the runs that we've had enjoyed prior to, say, 1990?
I'm probably not competent to answer that question. I do know that, for example, in 1941, with the original configuration of the natural, if you will, restored system, that there was a certain range of water levels in the canyon that was impassable to fish. And normally the river dropped through that range fairly quickly and wouldn't delay fish for very long. But in 1941, that water came down into that range and stayed in that range for 6 weeks. And it was during the upstream migration of the choco sockeye and Quesnel sockeye. And we don't know the numbers of Quesnel sockeye in total. There wasn't any racial ID work, but only 1,000 fish were estimated to have reached the spawning grounds that year, and nearly extinguishing the stock. And from that 1,000 fish in 1941, with virtually no fish in any other line years, the Quesnel run was rebuilt to where it produced over 10 million fish in 1993.
I think that's a sufficient answer. When the IPFSC turned over the fishery to the Pacific Salmon Commission compared to when they got it, fair to say that was a pretty remarkable achievement that anybody involved could be proud of in terms of rebuilding Fraser River sockeye?
I think certainly anybody that worked with the IPSFC felt that they had done a good job in fulfilling the mandate that the IPSC had been given by the countries.
Thank you, Mr. Woody. I have a few questions for Mr. Walters. You still there, Mr. Walters? Dr. Walters? Thank you. It's the question that I want to clarify from this morning that Mr. Rosenblum raised, and I see if I can put it fairly simply. After 100 years of fishing at an 80% exploitation rate, according to what you saw, only 3 sockeye stocks were declining by about 1990. Do I have that correct?
I just looked at the more recent data period from 1950 to 1995, where there were high exploitation rates over that period. But I looked at 2 different data sets, one of them involving 28 stocks, a database that DFO Paul Ryle had put together in the PSC database. And there are 3 declining stocks out of the 28, I guess it was, or 27. Then I looked at a much larger DFO database with 106 time trends in it. A lot of those are spawning areas that we wouldn't necessarily consider to be distinct stocks. And in that database, I found 11 stocks declining over that period. So both cases, whether you aggregate or disaggregated data, it's about 10% of the stocks were declining. And a much higher percentage increasing, or stable or increasing, with some really remarkable rebuilding or recolonization and rebuilding, particularly in the early summer runs to the Shuswap region.
Thank you, Dr. Walters. I want to go to the issue of Cultus Lake because it comes up again and again. And we know that Cultus Lake sockeye have been in trouble. And they're a unique fish in that they actually spawn in the lake and stay in the lake. Do I have that correct?
That's right. They're shoal spawners. Well, I don't think the actual spawning locations are well understood. But yes, they're pretty weird.
Now, were you aware that in the 1950s copper sulfate was dumped into the lake to try and reduce swimmer's itch?
No, I wasn't.
You're laughing. Does that mean you know what copper sulfate is?
The stock was relatively healthy. It was relatively stable in abundance. It didn't show cyclic patterns. So it wasn't until the 70s that it started to decline and moved into a cyclic pattern. At least according to the escapement records from the Salmon Commission.
Fairly heavy population pressure on Cultus Lake. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Recreational developments such as boating, cabins,
Yeah.
docks, and a boat launching site right next to one of the preferred beaches for the sockeye?
Yeah, and a whole bunch of other things impacting them, like a conservation hatchery that's supposed to save them, that the scary possibility that it's hastening their demise. Oh, lots of things wrong with Cultus, yes.
Now, DFO, there was a successful predator removal program there at one point, as well as a milfoil program, but I gather that program has ran for a few years and then stopped for a long time. Can you tell me about that a little bit? Are you familiar?
I don't know about the milfoil program. As far as I understand, the predator control program, I believe it's still continuing. It did appear to increase survival rates in the lake, perhaps fairly substantially, but with the overall decline that's going on in the stock and so on, it's really hard to separate out the effects, the positive effects of that control program.
Those are my questions on Cultus, and I expect that we'll get back to that as we move through the process. The last bit of questions I have to you is on the exhibit that was entered this morning, the biological and fish-related aspects of overescapement in Alaska sockeye salmon. And are you familiar with the report, Mr. Walters?
Yeah.
Dr. Walters? I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I thought at page 15, on the second paragraph, there's a sentence. I just need to know if you kind of agree with what you might see. 22 of the 29 stocks exhibited a decrease in average yield when overescapement occurred. Averaged across all 29 stocks, yield decreased 48% when overescapement occurred relative to what the current escapement goal was met. On average, variability in yields increased 278% as overescapement occurred. Is that the type of issue that we were talking about in the concern this morning about overescapement?
In part, yeah. There's certainly an obvious increase in variability of returns when spawning stocks are high. It's by their definition of overescapement, there had to be a decrease in yields, right? So that's kind of, I guess you'd call it a circular argument, but
yeah.
Their definition is oriented and built around the presumption that the fundamental goal of management, in relation to your earlier discussion, is for the fisheries. And that definition is a fisheries management definition of overescapement.
That's very helpful.
It basically says don't waste fish.
As you go down the page a little bit, I was recalling the discussion about the impact of nutrients in the system, and down the page a little, it says reduced sockeye salmon production was associated with a decline in macro zooplankton density from 3,590 per cubic meter when escapements were within the current escapement goal to 140 per cubic meter. So a major decline in nutrients in the system. Is that a surprise?
No, the Alaskans have done a lot of really good research work on this whole business of marine-derived nutrients and their role in productivity, and they have a lot more case examples than we do of systems where the MDN effects seem to be large. In fact, the very first research that I know of by Ole Mathisen on the Kvichak stock in Bristol Bay, he insisted, and the data certainly seem to continue to support him, that marine-derived nutrients were critical to the health of that largest sockeye stock in the world. But one of the reasons we have to be really careful about that in BC, because we have at least a couple of our bigger stocks that don't have those benefits because they're spawning at outlets, Chilko and Adams. And as I mentioned yesterday, at least some of the MDN effects are already represented when we do the stock recruitment analysis, in the sense that the recruitments we observe have been impacted by those MDN effects. One of the things we expect to see if the marine-derived nutrient effects are really large, and expect the recruitment rates to increase disproportionately as spawning stock goes up from very low levels. We see very little indication of that kind of acceleration in productivity at lower stock sizes in the Fraser stocks. That was a long way of saying, yeah, it's neat stuff.
Okay. Near the end of the paper, they just have a conclusion. They say over-escapement in general is not sustainable, as it causes returns and yields to decrease in the next generation, which also results in lower escapements. The authors of the paper, Robert Clark, Mark Willett, Steve Fleischman, and Doug Eggers, are they credible scientists?
Yes, they are. Doug Eggers, in particular, has been a real leader in the development of salmon biology and salmon research and population dynamics over the years. Started out, like Jim Woody, working on Lake Washington, and developed a lot of our fundamental understanding about how the fish interact with the plankton communities in the lakes, and the really neat adaptations that that predator and prey have to one another. And I don't know the other people. I've met them, but I can certainly say that Doug Eggers is a major leader.
So, thank you. I think those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner. If I could only ask one thing, and it's if we could have Dr. Woody and Dr. Walters back at some time. Dr. Woody's the only scientist so far to appear before this commission that has had almost a perfect record of Fraser River sockeye management. In our little circles, we call him the Steve Nash of Fraser River sockeye. And I think he can offer an awful lot on management decision-making processes, much more than the subject he was confined to today. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, the witnesses.
I'm sorry, before you leave the seat, sir?
Yes?
Mr. Isaac? I'd just like to say, be happy to come back. I'm going to be giving a lecture tomorrow to the University of Florida students about decision-making processes in fisheries. And I'm going to use the contrast between the Pacific Salmon Commission's management approach that you've asked Jim to describe with relatively clear, relatively simple objectives. I'm going to compare and contrast that to what I heard about the DFO management system as described to the Cohen Commission this last fall. And I would really like to speak more to that. That DFO system is a structured decision-making process that, in my view, is pathological.
Thank you, Dr. Walters.
The next participant is the West Coast Trollers Area G with Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Again, it's Chris Watson for the West Coast Area G and the United Fishers and Allied Workers Union. At the risk of blowing my time estimate out of the water, Dr. Walters, I'm very curious for you to pick up on the very last point that you made about the DFO system and it being pathological. Could you describe for the Commission, please, what you meant by that?
That system is what we call a structured decision-making process, in which a group of scientists, DFO staff, and so on work with stakeholders to try to reach some kind of consensus on matters like the TAM rules, the harvest policy rules, and to, at least as it was described by DFO staff last fall, also in in-season decision-making. My experience with those kind of processes is that
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if I could speak to this before he answers this question.
Dr. Walters, just hold on a moment. Thank you.
I'm loath to become argumentative on this matter, but we're having a difficulty staying on topic. That's been something we've been asked to be encouraged to do, this entire commission. There are a zillion topics. If Mr. Walters' opinion on this is valuable to the commission, I suggest it be provided when we're dealing with this topic and not dealing with the topic of delayed density dependency. And we can't keep cross-examining on new topics, on new ideas in the moment, and try to get finished today's topic, never mind else. We've been encouraged all along through this commission to stay on topic.
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I'm very much in your hands on that. This is a dynamic process, of course. Dr. Walters is here. If there's an opportunity for him to come back to elaborate, then that would be...
Well, let me make it really, just to give you a really quick answer. Related to the issue of low exploitation rates in recent years and possible over-escapement. As I see the way that decision process works, people that are involved in it are thrown a huge variety of statistics and models and calculations and so on like that. Bewildering variety that I, even as an analyst who develops those kind of models, would be at a loss to advise about policy in those settings. It's just too complex. I think an outcome of that kind of process is extreme decisions. People grab onto simple objectives like let's protect cultists, and they cling to those objectives rather than looking broadly at the impacts, economic and impacts on fishermen and other things. More than that, I think those processes are vulnerable to inadvertent or deliberate abuse by the science staff through the way the information is presented. So, for example, the wild salmon policy information as it was presented to the Commission this last fall involves these red light, green light, yellow light things for a large number of stocks. That kind of way of presenting information invites misinterpretation. It invites poorly balanced decision making. There's a need to return to simpler overriding objectives, clear priorities, hierarchical objectives in decision making with regard to allocation among user groups, always with conservation first. There are a lot of ways to improve the decision, to simplify and improve the decision process to make it work more like the Salmon Commission's process did.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Walters. I have just a couple of questions for you, Dr. Walters, and really following from your evidence yesterday to bring clarification, at least to me. In direct examination of you by Ms. Baker, you were asked to clarify the experiment to rebuild the off-cycle years, and that's the strategy that is that the strategy you were asked that we've heard being called the rebuilding strategy? And you said that's right, the one that seems to be failing, and that if we had paid closer attention to Dr. Woody and paid closer attention to other long-term analyses done by the Pacific Salmon Commission staff like Gilhausen, we probably would not have recommended. So if you can recall, Dr. Walters, what was being said at that point in time? I understand this would be 1985, 86, or 87, in that range, by Gilhousen, Dr. Woody, that if you had been paying attention to, the rebuilding strategy would not have been recommended.
The key thing that the key mistake I believe we made came out in a paper by Jeremy Cawley and I and Randall Peterman in 1990. That's when we sort of officially recommended the off-cycle rebuilding experiment and talked about how to do that in terms of the timing groups. In that paper, we did a formal decision analysis, did a kind of cost-benefit and risk analysis type calculation of whether it was worth pursuing the experiment, because there would be immediate losses in fishing and so on. And we overtly discounted the possibility of strong delayed density dependent effects. We said we just don't believe the Larkin model. We don't believe the delayed effects could be so large. And had I known about it, had we looked at the Gilhousen, or I guess it wasn't out quite then, looked even more carefully at Ricker's older work and seen the violence of the originals, I'd have taken Jim Woody's warnings a lot more seriously. We'd have left the Larkin model in our decision analysis, and it would have very likely told us that the downside potential loss of the experiment exceeded its potential benefits.
Okay. Thank you. And
we would have proceeded with much more cautious recommendations about the possible downsides of the experiment.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Walters. My other question is, stems from a question from Ms. Baker further along yesterday, and it started in being addressed to Dr. Woody about maximum sustained yield, MSY, and after Dr. Woody said what he had to say, you said that it was discovered in the early 1970s that in general the maximum average yield is a better word than sustained yield. Maximum average yield for long periods of time is obtained by following a fixed escapement policy, not a fixed harvest rate policy, and not any other more complex rule. So if we could underscore fixed escapement policy, and I want to ask you, sir, what you mean by fixed escapement policy. Is it do you mean a hard cap on the number of fish escaping, or is it a percentage? And if it's a percentage of what rate?
It's a number, it's a spawning stock number, X million fish. And when the total run is less than that number, you take nothing. When the run is above that number, you take all of the surplus above the number.
All right.
In other words, you try to hold the spawning stock at that single target level, and let all of the variability in recruitment be absorbed by the fishery. So it turns out that the maximum average yield policy also maximizes variability seen by fishermen. It's a peculiar result. It can be proven mathematically that for a really wide range of population dynamics models and so on, it's a very robust result. And it's been confirmed through optimization and simulation studies repeatedly since then. But we also found at that time, and we've just published a couple of years ago an analysis of the Fraser River sockeye historical data, with using the historical variability to look at different harvest strategies, that with a relatively minor loss in long-term yield, about less than 10%, it can move to a fixed harvest rate policy, a fixed proportion harvested each year. So that causes over-harvesting in some years relative to the optimum spawning stock, and then in other years that you under-harvest a bit. It results in a minor loss in yield, but it dramatically stabilizes fishing opportunities. And it's much simpler to implement in the field. We can implement fixed harvest rate strategies simply by fixing the times and areas of fishing at locations where we have reasonable confidence about what proportions of the stock will be at risk to harvest. And then let fishermen take essentially everything that's in the area, those areas at those times. That's really what made the historical management system successful in the first place, was that fisheries took place in restricted times and areas that where they took a relatively stable and predictable proportion of the runs.
Thank you,
Long
Dr.
answer, eh?
Thank you, Dr. Walters. Those are my questions.
Gay Lowe's for the BC Wildlife Federation and BC Federation of Drift Fishers. Just a couple of questions. First of all, some fundamentals upon which most of the discussion about over-escapement has taken, over the last couple of days, has taken place. Population dynamics is a discipline that is not confined to fish. It's a basic biological discipline, and the principles are well known biologically. Is that correct, Dr. Walters?
Yes.
And in fact, the discipline goes back to, I believe, the 17th century with Malthus?
That's correct.
Yeah. And so the discussion that's taken place over the last 2 days or so is really a discussion about the application of principles that have been studied for a couple of centuries.
Yeah, Malthus pointed out that natural populations of people or anything else cannot continue to grow indefinitely, that they must exhibit what we nowadays call density dependence. He had a view that things were very catastrophic, that things would build up and catastrophically over-harvest food supplies, and wars and famine and pestilence. Bad things would bring populations back down. We now understand that it's generally the case that as natural populations increase, there's a progressive decrease in reproductive success, in productivity. As animals become more crowded, they're forced to use less suitable reproductive sites. They encounter less food, and their juveniles need to spend more time feeding and be eaten more by predators. So it's a bit different picture than his, but not fundamentally.
And you've used the term a couple of times, violent cycles. Am I correct that violent cycles are not, in nature, are not confined to salmon and not confined to Fraser River sockeye salmon?
No, there are cyclic sockeye populations up in Alaska as well, like the Kvichak historically was the biggest of them all. There are lots of cyclic animal populations. I guess in Canada the most famous are lynx and hare cycles. There's also a wolf-moose cycle of much longer, 35 to 40-year period. Generally, the belief among ecologists, though it hasn't been proven, is that these are associated with predator-prey relationships.
And am I correct, Dr. Walters, that the density-dependent effects are primarily related to, or primarily impacts to survival rather than fecundity? In other words, the number of eggs that are laid are by and large the same amount from year to year. It's the survival of the eggs or the fry?
Yeah, that's right. We see weak dependence of body size on abundance, and with that a small change in fecundity at very high densities. But salmon seem to insist on translating competitive effects that would normally impact their growth. They translate much of that effect into changes in survival rate by changing their behavior so as to try to maintain growth. As Jim Woody's pointed out, juvenile sockeye certainly do show density-related changes in growth as well as survival, but those get pretty much wiped out by compensatory feeding as the animals get older.
And at what stage of their life cycle are the sockeye most vulnerable to density-dependent effects?
There's a few examples where we see apparently strong density dependence in the egg to fry stage, indicating probably limitations on the availability of good spawning habitat. But for the larger stocks, most of the density-dependent mortality appears to occur early in the first summer of life in the lake. So that by the time acoustic sampling of fry that have been in the lake for about 4 or 5 months in late summer in Shuswap and Quesnel, by that time we're already seeing quite a strong density-dependent survival relationship. But we think that continues on at least through till a smolt stage, and may even be occurring in the ocean as well.
Does anyone on the panel have a challenge to that evidence or would like to express agreement?
Go ahead, Jim. Well, I wasn't sure what Carl meant. I mean, you asked about fecundity. There are significant effects on fecundity with very large population sizes. The animals can get quite small. That is one of the extraordinary events of 2010, where you had an extraordinarily large run and very big fish. That is definitely an exception in that. And so the density effects can be carried through to fecundity. That definitely does occur.
Yeah.
Dr. Woody?
Just to follow up on Dr. Walter's comments about the lake, it's become my judgment, if you will, that most of what we're seeing in cyclic dominance is occurring in the lakes. That's just from my personal perspective. It's where that the resources are more limited, et cetera, and therefore I believe most of the density-dependent issues become expressed there. What we see as far as fecundity is that the ocean environment changes are probably much more effective in determining fecundity, number of eggs that each female has. When we look at the regime shift in 1977, fish size declined, mature adult sockeye fish size declined beginning at that point after being fairly stable, and in fact in the late 40s and early 50s quite high, quite large fish. And size dropped off, and thus fecundity is dropping off. And fecundity is set fairly early, well, a combination of, maybe I shouldn't say this because Brian would probably correct me on it, but the fish try to maintain an egg size, so fecundity is going down in order to put the resources into fewer eggs and maintain the egg size. And but we've seen both very large runs with large size and very small runs with small size. So I think the expression of size and thus fecundity is something that is a marine-derived issue, but not so much the density dependent.
Dr. Walters, in another conversation with me, you expressed the issue about reducing fishing or increasing fishing in terms of the precautionary approach. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
Could you perhaps put the debate or the issue that we've heard about over the last 2 days in terms of the precautionary approach?
Well, the precautionary approach it appears in our management systems in two ways. The original definition of it involved the avoidance of irreversible harm. And in that traditional definition, irreversibility refers primarily to avoiding extinction in stocks. But we use the term also to refer to adjustments we make in management to reflect the uncertainties that we have. So there are adjustments to escapement goals on the Fraser routinely that I don't think anybody argues aren't needed, especially in recent years. There's an escapement add-on to allow for the possibility of pre-spawning mortality. So the escapement goal will be set above what we think the fish will actually reach the grounds to allow for that. Those risk adjustments or precautionary adjustments are felt by the fishermen directly as a reduction in harvest. So you can think of them as essentially a risk premium, a lost catch risk premium that is imposed on the fishery. I think one problem we have in our management systems is that we have not paid enough attention to what are the risk premiums that our fishermen must bear are reasonable and fair and necessary. They have been very large in recent years.
I was referring, Dr. Walters, to a question about the precautionary principle as it applies to the return to the historical levels of the production of the Fraser River.
Well, you came to a seminar, and you heard me say this. I believe that I don't know what is precautionary right now on the Fraser. The simple fisheries idea of precautionary management is when you're not sure, reduce the harvest, try to increase the spawning stock size. But in the presence of possibly strong delayed density dependent effects, that may do more harm than good. And in Jim Woody's world of cyclic dominance, precautionary management is not to increase escapement, it's to prevent the breakdown of the cycle. That's what he would call the risky decision option. So I don't think we even know anymore what it means to be precautionary in the Fraser sockeye management system.
Dr. Woody, would you agree with Dr. Walters' description of what your description of the precautionary principle in these terms would be?
Mr. Commissioner, from my perspective, the attempt to so-called rebuild stocks, off-cycle stocks, and so on, that carries in the precautionary line idea is probably not well-founded, at least, if not wrong. There are certainly issues that need to be looked at seriously by good scientists as to whether or not risks are increased by not being precautionary in actuality. And as Dr. Walters is pointing out, the protection, I'll point out that the protection of the dominant line escapement should be the principal goal. for any individual stock, and that attempting to modify fishing regulations in order to build up offline, particularly the lower lines of Shuswap and Quesnel, can backfire by the fact that you've got this delayed density dependence issue, and you can then feed back on us on the affecting the dominant line production. Just on that issue, evening out the 4 lines, which was part of the original strategy DFO undertook several years ago, to our thinking would mean that you would simply be causing the predator populations to become more stable and larger, and thus increase the overall predation rate and reduce the productivity of the stocks overall compared to what we get with the cyclic dominance pattern.
Thank you. Those are my questions, and may I say to the whole panel, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to listen to you over the last day and a half.
Mr. Commissioner, would you like to take the afternoon break before I get started? I'm totally in your hands on that. I don't mind you starting. All right. If you're comfortable with that. I'm sorry?
Can I just mention that?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Gertner has kindly let me just mention and refer to an exhibit. A number of the panelists have this morning and elsewhere in these hearings referred to Sue Grant's paper. And I just wanted to have one of the witnesses, I think Dr. Riddle might be the easiest to see the cover of Exhibit 184 and see if you can identify that as what's being spoken of, just so you've got a reference to what they were referring to when they speak of Sue Grant's paper. Now, I appreciate that's only the cover. Is there something that we can take you to, Dr. Riddle, that would allow you to pick out whether that's what you and others have been referring to?
No, the cover is fine. That's the paper.
All right. So that's Exhibit 184, Mr. Commissioner.
That's the WSP CSAP doc?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Brenda Gertner for the First Nations Coalition. Mr. Commissioner, earlier in this hearing in the Inquirer, you've had an opportunity to hear a number of Aboriginal witnesses, and I just wanted to bring some of their comments around delayed density dependency, or what biologists call that, to your attention and attention of others. I don't think it will come as any surprise, but I think it's useful to have their words and their ideas in our minds as I begin my work today. You would have recalled, you heard from the chief of Willie Charlie who's from Chehalis, who's at the mouth of the Harrison River, and you heard from Chief Fred Sampson, who's in the middle of the Fraser River above Hell's Gate, and then you heard from Grand Chief Saul Terry from the Stadlium, whose village sits at the mouth of the Bridge River, and you'll recall that you spent time there. Then you also heard from Dr. Ron Ignace from the Schwepmic and former Chief Alexis, whose territories the homes of many of these spawning grounds and natal lakes are located in. And you'll recall that evidence that from the perspective of these Aboriginal people and whose territories and water systems and fisheries and families and communities that have relied on this system since time out of mind, they don't have a word for what the English call over-escapement. They weren't able to tell you stories of this notion of over-escapement. You heard that from their cultural perspective, salmon have a vital role in the entire ecosystem, and that they are an indicator of the health of that ecosystem. You also heard from them the stories that they do carry, which is that elders remember stories and times when fish was so abundant that they could walk across the river on the backs of the fish. Now, I want to recall also that when Dr. Ignace gave evidence, and that panel gave evidence, and we spoke about this at a preliminary level deliberately because we anticipated panels like this, he wanted very carefully to bring to mind a Schwepmec story, an ethics story that all of their fishermen from a very young age and for a very long time are taught. And I'm not going to tell the whole story. We won't take that time. I'll just remind you of that story. And that was the story of the coyote, who was critical and an extremely important part of bringing salmon to their people and to their villages. But that story also included the importance of learning that if you take salmon for granted and you harvest them too much, and you have a lot of pride about how well you can harvest them, that the salmon themselves will respond to that and leave their relationship with people. And it's with that in mind, and I ask you to keep that in mind. I'm going to turn to only a few matters as it relates to delayed density dependence, or those words that we hear in English called overescapement. My questions at the beginning will primarily be addressed to you, Dr. Riddle, and I'm going to do something slightly different than the questions that have happened. I'd like to take Dr. Riddle through some work that was done in response to the 1999 collapse, and a meeting that occurred that Dr. Riddle was present to. I'm going to take him through a number of these things and get to the conclusions around delayed density dependence. That might take a little time, and then I'll ask the other panel members to respond to it. But I'd like to get all the way from the beginning to the end, to the conclusions, before we turn to the other panel members. And so, Mr. Lund, could you call up Exhibit 73? So, Dr. Riddle, this was synthesis of evidence at a workshop that occurred in June of last year. And I see that you were present at this workshop. Do you recall this workshop, and do you recall your participation in this workshop?
Yes, I do.
And would you like to, Mr. Commissioner, you've heard a little bit about this workshop, but maybe you could refresh Commissioner's memory on the purpose of this workshop and the goal of this workshop. Dr. Riddle?
Well, the workshop was organized through the Pacific Salmon Commission. The United States and Canada both are, of course, concerned about the explanation for what occurred in 2009. They struck a subcommittee to organize this workshop, and what they did then is identify key people that could address a number of hypotheses that people had posed that might explain the loss of fish, or the fish not returning in 2009. If I recall exactly, there were 12 hypotheses that were identified, and a group of people were assigned to, mostly people working in that area, of course, to make presentations to the workshop. There was then I guess called a science panel that was working with Dr. Randall Peterman as chair and David Marmorak as the facilitator and a reporter in that. And we worked with that subcommittee for 2 or 3 days after to write reports on each of the hypotheses. That advisory committee then discussed the reports of the participants and determined then what were the sort of ratings that you would assign for abilities to explain the 2009 loss, and to then subsequently make recommendations back to the Pacific Salmon Commission on what might be done to follow up from this workshop.
I wonder if you could go first to page 33 of the document itself, which is in the introduction. Dr. Riddle, you said 13, but I see 9 items listed as the hypothesis. You may have started with 13. Did they get simplified to 9? They're just at 1.1.
Yes, I think if you go to the tables, that there are a number of subcomponents to some of these.
Okay, and you'll see, Mr. Commissioner and Dr. Riddle, it's true that delayed density-dependent mortality is one of those topics, and it's found at number 7. Is that correct?
Yes, and presented by Dr. Walters.
Thank you. And at page 35 of the document, I want to go to the first paragraph in 1.4, and the writers of the report begin with a qualification about realistic expectations, and I'm going to start with the second sentence of that. The dynamics of any ecosystem, including the freshwater and marine ecosystems traversed by Fraser River sockeye, are affected by multiple simultaneously operating natural and human sources of variability. It is therefore very unlikely that there is a single cause of the long-term decrease in productivity of Fraser sockeye, or that there is a single cause behind the extremely low returns in 2009. Such reductions can arise from several mechanisms that occur in one or more places in the salmon life cycle, ranging from poor variability of eggs to reduced survival rates of juveniles and mortality of fish while at sea. It is also clear from the previous research on salmon, as well as many other species of animals, that changes in one mortality agent can interact with other mortality factors to produce complicated net effects. Do you still hold that as a true overview of some of the challenges around Fraser River sockeye?
Yes, I do. That was written by the Science Advisory Panel, so that is the opinion of several of us that contributed.
Then I'm going to ask if you could go to page 44 of that report. And you'll see at page 44 that we're now in the section of the document 3.1.1.2, residuals of productivity indicators to account for density dependence. And I'm not going to try to read the paragraph I'm going to turn you to. It's the second large paragraph, and there's a lot of correlations that are discussed in it. I'm wondering if you could take your time to look at that. And it's my understanding from that paragraph that the stocks with the lowest correlation between the residual indicators of productivity and the standard non-residual indicator tended to be those whose spawner abundance has increased dramatically in the last 20 years or so. Example, Quesnel, Stalaco, and Pitt. And I wonder if you could explain that. That it's a bit of a challenge for me to understand.
Well, I think you have the author sitting with us. This is a summary of Dr. Walters' presentation. And that, so.
All right, Dr. Walters, could you explain that sentence then?
Could you repeat the sentence? I don't remember.
Oh, you don't have it present. Okay.
I'll read it again. Stocks with the lowest correlation between the residual indicator of productivity and the standard non-residual indicator tended to be those in which spawner abundance has increased dramatically in the last 20 years or so. Quesnel, Stalaco, and Pitt.
That's not my writing. I'm sorry. That's I believe that's a review of Randall Peterman's work. And frankly, I can't answer you. I have no idea what that sentence means.
Well, I feel complicated that I found a hard sentence.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that I can give you an easy answer either, unfortunately.
All right. Perhaps if it becomes relevant, we'll ask Randall Peterman if that's who we think it is. I'm going to now take you to page, I don't want to take further time of that today. I'll take you to page 85 of that report now.
I just emailed the exhibit to Dr. Walters.
I think he got the sentence and he had the same difficulty with it, but I'm glad that he has the report. Thank you. And again, I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier in the evidence, but I want to make sure we understand this going forward. At page 85, there's a sentence that says, delayed density dependence does not appear as significant in the smaller stocks. And is that primarily because the smaller stocks are unlikely to flood their spawning grounds or their nursery lakes?
Yeah, that's a point we've discussed several times on this panel.
All right.
Yeah, if they're small and they're in an environment that's still fairly healthy and productive, then you would not expect to see that effect.
All right, so we're primarily talking about larger stocks that are of concern, and we're going to get to the Quesnel stock in particular in a few minutes. And then at page 86 of the report, there is this sentence. at the top of the page, the effects of delayed density dependence on changes in productivity will be most evident in stocks with a large range of abundance of spawners over the years.
Yes, we've talked about that extensively. This is the contrast through the range of spawners, where you have to have some substantially above the optimum level to really see that interaction.
And then I want to take you finally to the panel's opinion on the effect of delayed density dependence on long-term decline in productivity in the 2009 event. Right at the bottom of page 86, the last paragraph in 4.7.5. The panel's opinions about the effects of delayed density dependence on the long-term decline of Fraser sockeye productivity ranged from likely to possible to unlikely as a contributing factor. So it's clear amongst that panel that in terms of its long-term effects, it's not clear. And panel members agreed, however, that delayed density dependence is very unlikely to have played a role in the 2009 event. Is that conclusion something that you still hold today, Dr. Riddell?
Well, let me clarify. This is the opinion of about 9 or 10 people. It's not my personal opinion, right? And that's why you see this range. All the participants that were at the workshop and heard the presentations of the hypotheses were asked at some point to clarify, and well, in their opinion, to rate what's the level of information, then would it suggest a contribution to the long-term decline, which we've been hearing about since the early 1990s, as opposed to contributing to the sudden decline that we observed in 2009. And in something like the delayed density discussion that we've heard here, many people were really probably encountering that discussion for the first time, and so you have this fairly wide range of whether or not that was contributing to the long-term decline. Whether it contributed specifically to 2009, most people felt much more strongly that it would not have. And that my personal opinion on this is that seeing some of Carl's work through the last year, I would suggest that it is a likely cause contributing to the long-term decline. Right? Others didn't share the same opinion. I think most people there, obviously the science panel, felt that it was unlikely to be a major cause of the sudden and large decline in 2009 alone.
Okay, and then I thank you for that, and I just want to now take you to the and bring to the attention of Mr. Commissioner the proposed research and the management actions that were the outcome of the work that this panel did as it relates to delayed density dependence. And in particular, you'll see that at the bottom of page 86 and over to page 87. As I understand it, this panel of experts recommended research in 4 areas, in the making adjustments to the Frizzy model, better fitting the Larkin and the Ricker models, having a better measures of abundance of different life cycles, having a better understanding of food supply dynamics, and better research into predator-prey, disease, and food supply relationships. And finally, another area where proposed research was made was in contrasting management strategies should be applied to different stocks over enough time to observe the responses. Now, those are all proposed research items that seem abundantly useful given the evidence that we've heard today. Does anybody, Dr. Riddell, do you have any clarifications with respect to that proposed research? And I would welcome the panel as it relates to those 5 items.
Yeah, well, as one of the committee writing it, I mean, this was a representation of what the science panel felt was stated on this particular topic by the participants. I would point out, though, that later in the document, where you're looking at all of the hypotheses and a very long list of research, because every one of them had 4 or 5, then we had much more focused discussion about what are the immediate priorities and where would you target your studies to answer those 2 questions, the long-term decline and 2009.
Yes, I appreciate that this is only as it related to delayed density dependence, right. And I'm going to stick on topic as it relates to that today. And then of that list of the 5, it seems 1 to 4 are automatically, in my mind, precautionary. You're doing research. You're not in any way interacting directly with management strategies that may affect one or other stock. Those are all just good sense kinds of things that could be useful to do. Would you agree with me on that? And that item number 5, if we're going to introduce management strategies to specifically understand at an adaptive level, preferably rather than at an experimental level, we're going to need to take some precaution with that.
Well, the first 4 really are recommendations that we've talked about in the past. I mean, they're all about better information in the lakes and looking at what the causes are. The final one, as you're pointing out, involves management strategy changes or a adaptive management study, as Carl's referred to, and that would take more planning, because that could cause, impacts on fisheries, as we've talked about already as well.
And impact on fish.
On fish, yeah.
And then you went on to, or the group went on to talk about management actions under that, Mr. Commissioner, at 4.7.7. They spoke about particular items. One is as it relates to the Frizzy model, and we've heard a number of people directly involved in the Frizzy model already, and exploring the total allowable mortality rules that result from that, in particular making sure that cyclic dominance patterns are considered in the context of total allowable mortality. And then particularly the wild salmon policy benchmarks need to account for cyclic, the nature of some of the conservation units. And then if the mechanisms for delayed response can be determined, mitigation of those factors may be possible. Again, those are all management actions that seem reasonable in the circumstances, given the evidence that we've heard in the last 2 days?
I would still say so, yes.
Now, this might be an appropriate time to ask from the panel whether there's any of the other members of the panel have any comments as it relates to those recommendations or the responses of Dr. Riddle on these topics. Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to go to two other items. One will take a little bit of time and the other even shorter. I'm happy to keep going, but it may be an appropriate time to take a short break.
I wonder if I could just ask the panel on these last few points, just to assist me. I don't have a glossary of terms necessarily that is one that perhaps all of those in the field have agreed upon.
There's one in this one.
In this document, but I'm talking about this document, outside this document. In terms of using the term cyclic dominance and the term overescapement and the term delayed density dependence, and there's one, I saw another one. Was it delayed density independence? Was that? I saw another term used in one of the documents here recently, and there's other terminology used in the Frizzy model documents that I won't go to, but my question is, can I be satisfied that all of you who've been in the field for as long as you have been, when you use those terms, you're all talking about the exact same phenomena? In other words, there's a common ground amongst those in the field when you talk about cyclic dominance, overescapement, delayed density dependence, and so on. So when I see those terms in different documents, I can reflect back on your answers and understand that you did have a common ground understanding about those phenomena or those terms.
Well, let me start. I think amongst the people involved with these science reviews and the discussion we've had here, that I would say that we would have a common understanding. But the art of communication with many other people means we probably should provide you a glossary, and that might be actually quite a useful thing to contribute, and that those are not all that easy to write and that get that clarity. So we could certainly do that in the future. But I think amongst people involved with this professionally that we would have a common understanding.
If I see the term delayed density dependence, can I equate that to cyclic dominance?
No.
Why?
You can have delayed density dependent effects. That term delayed density dependence you can look up in ecology textbooks, right? I mean, this is not our word. It's a textbook term in the science of ecology. But cyclic dominance is a particularly strong expression of the ecosystem interactions that lead to delayed effects. So you have delayed effects and still have a relatively stable population size. Our estimated delayed effects are quite strong on the early Stewart, but it doesn't cycle.
So cyclic dominance is a particular type of the delayed density dependence,
Right.
and a very strong example.
So that would be a consistent ground of understanding throughout these different research papers that I've been presented with.
Well, I don't know. I guess my opinion would be I would hope so. I would think so.
All right.
I don't know. Carl, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard anything certainly around this table that would indicate any inconsistency. There used to be a bit of confusion about what we meant by cyclic dominance. And there's the thing, the DSLL definition that Jim Moody and I published in a paper some years ago. That seems to be the one that everybody pretty much uses now in reference to the phenomenon. There's things that are sort of cyclic and things that are regular, and the cyclic dominance being the regular ones with a particular pattern. And Jim defined this for you as we use the term today, early in this panel.
Right.
Mr. Commissioner, it actually was a line of questioning I was going to ask. I just have one follow-up to that, if I may. I just want to make sure I understand it. It's a regular response by, in this case, we'll talk about sockeye salmon, to the environment they're experiencing. That's how we get the strong cyclic patterns for some of the Fraser sockeye that have been around for a long time. In fact, there seems to be some debate that that's a natural phenomenon and may actually explain the predator-prey relationship that salmon have worked out. But it's also could be salmon's response, or sockeye salmon's response, to a changing environment. Is that correct?
No, it's too regular. When we see patterns with such regular period and regular pattern in nature, we assume that there's a set of repeatable ecological feedbacks involved in producing them. Other kinds of variation don't produce that regular pattern.
And let me just add, too, that, I mean, I think we spent quite a bit of time on this yesterday, that there was a consideration that were we seeing cyclic dominance because of fishing pressures and the response of the fish. And there were questions to us about do we think it has a biological basis now. I think that all of us came back and said, yes, we believe that it has a biological basis. And that now, we do know it can be changed, because it has actually changed in the Fraser system. Because of an enormous environmental event, we did shift by 1 year from a 1913 cycle to a 1914 cycle. And so, I mean, it can change biologically, but the extreme nature of very strong, very modest, and then much smaller, that pattern has certainly reestablished itself through time. So it can change, but it's coming back to a biologically based cycle.
Right, and so in fact that biological response to Hell's Gate was, it may have taken the salmon quite a long time to re-establish their cycles, but that may be one of the observed things that we've watched over the last century, is a huge change by Hell's Gate. We also have the Quesnel logging incident that affected Quesnel Lake. Those are two large impacts on the runs, and we're watching salmon, with human assistance or otherwise, respond to those very strong impacts in their environment. Correct?
Well, yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, that the animal is able to come back from these major events that we've caused, but they come back in the Fraser sockeye in this cyclic dominance in these particular lakes. And I think Carl made a good point about that yesterday, in terms of we do see this pattern reestablishing.
And so it's quite possible that cyclic dominance is a very good thing for salmon.
I think that's where we're coming to.
Yes. Do you want me to keep going, Mr. Commissioner?
Sorry, could I ask for clarification? A very good thing for salmon.
For Fraser sockeye.
Fraser sockeye salmon, sorry.
What one would mean by
For
that?
those Fraser sockeye salmon that have
We
cyclic
understand in
dominance.
general to be negative feedback, i.e. they're predators that are eating them or parasites or diseases that are attacking them or they're running out of food. It's hard for me to imagine how anyone would call that positive for salmon.
Ms.
Your
Gardner,
question was how much longer I'll be.
Right.
I have one item that may take about 10 minutes and one that will take 5. I would say 15 minutes.
All right, if it's, Madam Reporter, are you comfortable with that? Mr. Registrar, is that all right? Well, if the witnesses are comfortable, we'll go with that. Thank you, Ms. Gardner. Ms. Baker, will there be more questioning after that?
There might be a couple of minutes of questioning after that.
Just wanted to make sure we've heard from the panel around the Quesnel returns and the concerns that have been raised around Quesnel with a little bit more precision, if I may, Mr. Commissioner, because I expect that if this becomes important, that I'll seek to have Pete Nicklin, who's a biologist in the Upper Fraser watershed, speak to this on it. And I just want to make sure that what he says might be something this panel can respond to. And I think we're dealing with the same numbers, so I just want to make sure that that's true. Dr. Woody, you referred to the Quesnel returns in 2001 as being around 3.5 million and 02 around 3 million in your evidence yesterday. That's correct?
Those were the level of escapements to the spawning grounds in those 2 years, yes.
And that was in response to a peak actually in 97, if that's correct. If I've got my numbers right, there was a peak escapement in all of the areas of the Upper Fraser in 97. That would have brought us to 2001. And in 2000, and there was also, and that actually was the response to the 97 peak was good escapement in 01, and that was largely because the Quesnel numbers were quite large in 01. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, in 2009, which is the complementary years, we have the collapse in 2009, but we also have the evidence that suggests delayed density dependence was not a cause of that collapse, or not a significant cause of that collapse. And we just today, we've learned that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans have now publicized the escapement updates for 2010. And I just want to, if I may, Mr. Lunn, these are on the website, and I'd like to take you just to the paragraph on Quesnel and have you speak on this. So you'll see Mr. Lunn has taken you to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans website of 2010, and he's now going to take you to the component of that site that takes us to the 2010 summer run sockeye salmon. And on the third page of that, we have the report on Quesnel. And I expect that you may not have seen this, gentleman, at all, and so if you could just take a moment and read that paragraph. It appears that there's been spawning success for the Quesnel system in the 2010 year, well over the long-term system average of 84. We've got a 95.5% spawning success is how I read the concluding paragraph, concluding line of that paragraph. And that there, the escapement in 2010 represents the first increase relative to the brood year for this system since 2004, 69% greater than the 2009. And so I'm just wondering, given that positive return in 2010, and in particular as it relates to Quesnel, how that might inform your earlier comments around concerns around the Quesnel and its return. It appears that it did have trouble in 2009, well, it had trouble in 05 and 06, but in 09, but it is seeming to be responding well in 2010. The returns in 2006 were 169,000 roughly of spawners, and now in 2010 we have 249,000 spawners. Dr. Woody, would you like to respond to that? That would be helpful to us.
It's, the dominant line has for over 60 years been larger, both in terms of the total return and the escapement. So the larger than the subdominant or following year run. So now we come to 2009, and for the first time, the subdominant line run and escapement are larger than the dominant line. And this puts us into a point of we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the maintenance of that long-term cycle dominance that is the 2001, 2009 line. The escapement in the 2009 was small enough that it would be commensurate with almost as low as some of the low off years when it was cyclic dominance in the 80s, 90s, and up until now. There's certainly the possibility that this stock is going to switch dominant line, that is, become dominant on the 2010, and the possibility is there. I can't forecast that at all, but it will be very interesting to see. I have requested from Jeremy Hume, who's a biologist in charge of the Lake Survey Program, the data from the 2010 juvenile surveys to look at size and numbers of juveniles, and that will tell me quite a lot as to whether or not there will be much in the way of carryover effects, delayed density dependent effects on the 2010 run. It wouldn't take much more than a low marine survival in 2013 run to get that switched to the 2010. It may be a little up in the air right now, but we're certainly, when we did the simulation modeling of the work that I did in 2005, Kerry Holt, who has been a witness for you, but not on that subject, we presented two papers to the Pacific Salmon Commission Southern Endowment Fund, one on the what I call cyclic dominance issues and models for that, and then the second one is the simulation of those results. And her simulation results indicated that you would expect to get not infrequent switches as to what the dominant line would be. And so, in 10,000 runs, something like 50, 60%, 70% would maintain that cyclic dominance, and then the other times it would switch. And so it is another part of the experiment, I guess you would have to say, experiment that's been carried out because of the late run sockeye issues that are being managed for here.
Comment on that, Dr. Riddell?
Well, I think Jim's pointed out that it's going to be interesting to really monitor this lake system, because the dominant line and this subdominant line, those are very, very small escapements in an enormous lake, right? And they could easily carry the capacity of that spawn. And that, so who knows, maybe we'll see two lines competing with each other. We can sort this out.
Mr. Wilson, I don't want to overlook the fact that you have, of course, worked in the Upper Fraser also and know Mr. Nicklin. His comment as it relates to these numbers is it's hard for him to understand the concern around delayed density dependence. There appears to be lots of spawning capacity in the Quesnel Lake, or in the Quesnel system, and abilities in the lake. Do you have anything to add to that at this point in time?
Well, I would just say that, Mr. Commissioner, that I view cyclic patterns and returns in Fraser sockeye for many stocks to be an entirely natural circumstance, and I'm sure we all agree with that. So it doesn't really, from a biological perspective, it doesn't concern me that the dominant cycle might shift from one year to another. And I don't see that we should necessarily be managing to maintain a particular dominance pattern. I think we should let the Fraser sockeye do what Fraser sockeye do and adapt to those changes.
Just have one more line of questions, and they will be very brief, and they're for you, Dr. Walters. I got a little confused yesterday when you gave evidence in response to Ms. Baker's question. In particular, her question was, so how do you balance the protection needs for weak stocks like cultus against the risks of over-escapement? I don't want to go through that whole debate again, but we heard from each of the panel speaking about the biological issues around biodiversity and various different responses. But in your response, and I find that at page 61 of the transcript, your first response to this question is, I have to wear two hats in answering that question. You began as a biologist to say that you're in favor of biodiversity. I'm just curious. I looked at your resume last night, and I wonder what other hat you're wearing in answering this question, what other expertise you're speaking from.
My other response to you was speaking to you as a member of the public who is concerned about the people who are impacted by these policies.
All right, and then earlier today you gave evidence about some numbers you've run around the socioeconomic impacts of some of these decisions. We've heard from Dr. Riddell and that he felt that the numbers you have run within your models would require scientific review, and your suggestion is that go to Frizzy. So those are the first set of numbers you gave, but then you threw out another number that troubles me, and I want to make sure that we don't hear about it for the rest of the commission, which is this $200 million number as it relates to the impacts that these decisions are having. And again, I don't see in your resume any expertise for running that type of number. I wonder if you could explain that number. Is that a number that you've done?
Times the number of fish I calculate to have been lost from the catch.
Yeah, but how do you get to 200 million? And do you have expertise in running socioeconomic impacts associated with the loss of fish to Aboriginal communities or to other communities, the socioeconomic impacts? From my
biological loss of catch, which I calculate to be in the order of 20 million fish from the stock recruitment analysis, times $10 a fish.
And
it's a very simple indicator of landed value loss. That it's the only economic or social performance indicator, but it does bring home that there was substantial loss in income to people, wherever they are and whoever they are in the basin.
Dr. Walters, there isn't an indicator in your CV, and that's at Exhibit 415, of the socioeconomic expertise in developing socioeconomic analysis of the value of fish. Do you agree with me on that?
Well, yeah, I
actually
did a graduate minor in resource economics, but that was a long, long time ago. About all I can remember how to do these days is to multiply the price of a fish times the number of fish. As I told you, that's what I did. And I don't think that requires a huge amount of expertise in economics.
No, but I will suggest to you, from the work that I have done with experts on socioeconomic impacts associated with the loss of fish in Aboriginal communities, it's just not a simple number. And so you're suggesting that it is a simple number from your perspective, is that correct?
No, I gave you one
Could you
simple-
let me finish my question, please? And that you do not have expertise in running socioeconomic impact analysis on the loss of fish?
No.
Thank you, those are my questions.
Ms. Gardner, would you like to mark that last document, the
Yes.
final estimates or escapement estimates?
Thank you, yes, I would.
Could be marked as exhibit number 420.
Canada doing a re-exam of Dr. Riddle. I'm not sure exactly what your capacity is with Dr. Riddle on this panel, so.
I think that we've accepted that on this panel, Dr. Riddle is an eminently qualified scientist, and he's here in that capacity as distinct from a former DFO employee, so I'm not proposing to re-examine.
Thank you. I have just a couple of re-examination questions. Dr. Walters, when Don Rosenblum was asking you questions about whether there were any recommendations any of the panel members would have to resource managers, you said that you felt there should be a return to high harvest rates and that you should try to reestablish the cyclic dominance of some stocks, but you put a caveat on there and you said, but first, there are severe environmental effects on some stocks, and if survival declines in the high watershed need to be reversed before you would go to the recommendation that you made. Hopefully I've captured what you said. My question is, can you, first of all, identify which stocks you're referring to when you say that there are these environmental effects that need to be studied and understood first, and then second, what actually needs to be done to understand why there are these survival declines and to get the data needed, I guess, to satisfy you on that front?
Yeah, the Commission has engaged Randall Peterman to do a review of the stock productivity trends, and he's produced a very nice picture of where in the system these downward trends in productivity are occurring. And he will be complementing his earliest analysis with two improvements. One showing the residual deviations of survival variation not accounted for by the Larkin model as well as the Richter model. And he'll also be correcting a problem with the use of a thing called a Kalman filter, a statistical method for examining the trends in the data. His early reports underestimated the severity of the trends. So you'll see corrections on that. But my recollection, just off the top of my head, is that it's basically all of the upper basin stocks, all of the Stewart complex, to some degree the Quesnel, beyond what can be accounted for with any cyclic dominance effects, and on down. And it includes some lower system stocks too, like the Weaver Creek.
Okay, so can I take it then from that answer that the caveat that you were referring to is something that we'll get more information on when Randall Peterman's report is tendered in evidence and he's here to talk about it?
Absolutely. I can go through and describe stock by stock, but I think if you're willing to wait for his report, he has a very nice graphical way of summarizing a picture of where the survival declines are occurring and which stocks they're affecting.
Okay, thank you.
The geographic organization of this decline.
All right, well, we'll wait for Dr. Peterman to give us a bit more detail on that then. And then just to follow up a question that was put to you, or I guess it was, I'm not sure if it was a direct question on this, but in answer to some questions from Mr. Rosenblum, you talked about this retrospective analysis of loss, and Brenda Gartner has also talked to you about that just now. I just wanted to be clear, the numbers that you presented, which was you had done a calculation of $200 million loss in the 95 to 2009 period, plus maybe $40 million for 2010. Those calculations were done in an effort to get somebody to actually look at what the real loss would be, to actually engage in a full study to understand the loss. That's why you did those numbers. Is that right?
Well, I did the actual numbers were done in terms of numbers of fish, added numbers of fish that could have been caught.
Right, but I think you indicated that it was fairly rough, and there was things that in there that you hadn't taken into account. And your point was really to go to DFO, you said you went to Jeff Grout and others and said, look at, this is a problem, you need to look at this more carefully, you need to take it into account. That was why you did those numbers, is that right?
Yeah, I've been involved in publishing a couple of papers in recent years using this retrospective approach to analysis of past harvest management performance, and I now recommend it as a critical part of every fisheries management agency's practice.
Right, but
to go back and look at how much better they could have done, and to learn from that how to improve their management.
All right, but the point I just want to make sure we're clear on is the numbers that you talked about, you're not asking our commissioner today to rely on those as true numbers of loss. There hasn't been a study that actually has quantified that. You did some calculations to say, look, it's a problem, you should look at it more carefully, but you're not saying that the commissioner should be relying on any of those numbers that you presented here today as an accurate or true measure. Is that fair?
No number of that kind is guaranteed to be completely accurate. It involves predictions ahead that are highly variable and data that are noisy. But I think the calculations are correct, but Brian Riddell is absolutely right that this needs to go through a peer review process. It needs to be redone by DFO scientists using a larger set of stocks and better information.
Okay, thank you. So also some questions were asked to Dr. Woody about the early entry, late run issue, and Mr. Watson asked some questions, Mr. Eidsvik asked some questions about the experiment that was done. And I just wanted to confirm whether Dr. Riddle had anything to add to that discussion.
Actually, on that I do, because I think that as much as the response from Jim was correct in terms of what I think they referred to as the elephant in the classroom, that was not the experiment. And so I think we're confusing two very important considerations here. The experiment that I believe Carl was talking about, and Carl was very involved with in the late 80s, and he referred to a paper that he wrote with Jeremy Colley, that was the experiment. The experiment was developed to test whether we could restore, not restore, but increase the production of Fraser sockeye for everyone's potential use, commercial fishing, First Nations ecosystems.
This was the rebuilding strategy?
This was the rebuilding strategy. It was a very deliberate set of discussions following the 1985 treaty, and Canada at that time thinking that we should test whether we can improve sockeye production. And that experiment is where we were increasing the escapements. Now, what we subsequently heard from Dr. Woody was really a discussion about the way the environment changed in the midst of this study. The change in the sockeye biology in 1995, the change in the environmental conditions in the river and the in-river mortalities that we've subsequently had to deal with and develop the environmental watch program to compensate. Through the 1990s, these changes substantially increased the complexity of in-season management. This became a much more difficult task than had been faced previously. But those are not the experiment. The experiment had to go on in the face of that uncertainty. And so I think I agree with the way Carl described it yesterday in the sense that we've done the experiment, we need to move on. I absolutely agree to that. And that we can move on to a new experiment. We are not going to fix the sockeye behavior quickly, nor are we going to change the conditions in the river. We're still going to learn how to deal with those. And so the experiment and the subsequent environmental conditions really are two different elephants.
Right. And the Frizzy model and the TAM rules that have been created using the Frizzy model, those are, again, how does that relate to some of those concerns that you're talking about? Because I understand some of those constraints that have been put in place since the 90s operate. They're not independent of the escapement goals, obviously, but they're not generated through the Frizzy model. And in fact, the rules for harvest on the late run are not even generated using the Frizzy model. They're derived separately. Is that fair?
I would have to admit to being a couple of years out of date on the Frizzy model, but the Frizzy model, last I was really involved with it, did try to take into account in-river mortalities and project those. And so it does have the capability of incorporating those. it does add a great deal of uncertainty in how you do the assessment then, because your success in management in a year is confounded with the environmental quality of the year. And that, so it just still makes it more difficult.
And the experiment that you talked about in 1987, the rebuilding strategy, we're trying to even out the cycle years. The Frizzy model is not doing that either. Is that right?
No, the Frizzy model moves on from that. This is more, Carl described earlier today, the fixed escapement policy versus the fixed harvest rate policy. Well, you can also have a variable harvest rate policy, which is more what the Frizzy model is about. What's an appropriate harvest rate policy for the what we want to test in the Fraser, and what's the best way to manage our fisheries?
Right. But the point of Frizzy is not to try and even out the cycle lines and build up those off-cycle years.
No, unless I'm very mistaken. I don't believe that that's part of the discussion at all.
Thank you. Does anybody else?
It can make predictions about policies that would reinforce cycles, but it's not an objective of it to do anything like that.
Yeah.
Is there any other panel member which wants to respond to anything that's been raised in re-examination? No? Thank you. Those are my questions.
Is that...
I shouldn't be sitting down just yet. Sorry. So we are at 4 o'clock. This panel has been completed. Thank you very much for coming. Tomorrow we are going back to some of the decision-making panels that we started earlier this month. And on that note, if my friends could just stay after and talk to me about what I'm not clear who still needs to examine the first decision-making panel, so I'd appreciate it if you could just touch base with me on that front before you leave. And then I can also make some decisions about whether we can get Mr. Ryle on, who is the last witness that we have on this large topic of harvest management. So we may not be able to complete him tomorrow, but I'd like to make some judgment of that after I hear from people's estimates for tomorrow's panel.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Silence must mean that council are out of questions or just simply exhausted. So I want to very much, I just want to do a couple of things. I want to thank the members of this panel, including Dr. Walters, who was kind enough to come to us and is now leaving us. It is late in Florida. I don't know whether to thank the panel or not, because we started off this commission studying sockeye salmon. It appears we're now also examining and investigating elephants, but I'll stick with the sockeye for now. I wanted to thank all of the panel members very much. I was remiss yesterday. Ken Wilson was kind enough to lend us his expertise on not just this panel, but an earlier panel. I think I forgot to thank him and Mike Staley and Rob Morley and Al Cass when we completed that panel, so I do that now belatedly. I apologize for not doing that yesterday, and to express my deep appreciation to all the panel members, particularly Dr. Riddell, who seems to show up on a lot of panels, but thank you again for your patience, and thank all council for meeting your time commitments again. I'm very grateful for that. And thank you very much to our, Dr. Walters is back. I hope you'll accept our appreciation, Dr. Walters. Yes, I thought as much. We wish you had started drinking a little earlier in the day, actually. But thank you very much for being available to us on this link. And I gather we're back tomorrow morning again at 10 a.m. Is that right, Ms. Baker? Yes.
That's right.
Thank you, and thank you to our courtroom staff who are willing to sit straight through. Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day and will resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Carl.